I was buried beneath my shame. Who can carry that kind of weight? It was my till I met you. Come on! I was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my till I met you. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave. Chains break at the weight of your glory. I need shelter, I was an orphan. Now you call me a sinner. Come on! When I was broken, you were my healing. Now your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open. It's when you call my name.
Searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. Man's empty praise and treasures that fade are never enough. Then you came along and put me back together. Desire is now satisfied here in your love. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing turn boats into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who cares. You're the only one who cares. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing, Lord, better than you. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. There's nothing better than you. There's nothing, Lord, better than you. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. You turn graves into gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who cares. You're the only one who cares. You're the only one who
The new Grace Online is here. Grace Online is our brand new and experimental online church experience. We created it to optimize connection, conversation, and community. We want to learn about and follow Jesus together. Every Sunday night at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time at online.whoisgrace.com.
Here at Grace, we want to help people all over the world connect with each other and grow in their faith. And so that's why we're launching challenge groups as a new way to do this in the digital space. A challenge group is a short-term group of 5 to 10 people who connect daily through a Facebook group. Everyone will follow the same challenge guide with daily Bible readings, prayer prompts, and spiritual challenges. And your leader will provide direction and encouragement along the way. You can expect to spend anywhere between 5 to 30 minutes per day reading the Bible and connecting with God, and about 5 minutes catching up with your group and posting about your progress. No matter where you live or what your schedule is like, a challenge group provides the flexibility for you to participate at a time that works best for you. From the comfort of your home, office, dorm room, or favorite coffee shop. And all you need is your smartphone or your computer. If you want to grow in your faith and make some meaningful connections with others, a challenge group is a great short-term step for you. Whether you're new to your faith, new to grace, or just exploring Christianity, you will be welcomed in and encouraged wherever you are on that spiritual journey. See what groups are starting next and sign up today at whoisgrace.com/challenge.
Well, church, good morning. I'm so glad that you're watching today and joining us here at Grace this morning. I hope this time is encouraging, and more importantly, it gives you a chance to come just a little bit closer to God. Some of the most transformative events in our lives often involve struggle and loss and grief. And I think sometimes we only think about grief as a loss of life, but really grief is about the losses in life. So starting this week, and for the next 5 weeks, we're going to learn how to navigate the phases of grief. We're going to discern how we might be grieving today and if we are managing that grief in a healthy way. And I hope we also get to discern how we might help others in our lives who are grieving. In the end, we'll understand that biblical grief brings about change and healing and growth. Now, you've just seen some information about Grace Online and challenge groups, which are great ways to take your faith to the next level. So I want to especially encourage all of you who are watching this morning to give the new and experimental Grace Online a try. It's launching today. It would be a great companion to what you see this morning. Make it a part of your routine to regularly connect with God and others. So can I pray quickly for our time this morning? Father, you are so good, even in the lows of our life. And so as we get to explore grief and as we get to come together and worship and join with our brothers and sisters all across the area, would you just be present in our homes, in our hearts, and in this service this morning? Father, it is by the power of your Spirit, in the name of your Son, Jesus, that I pray this. Amen.
One name holds weight above them all. His fame outlasts the earth he formed. His praise resounds beyond the stars and echoes in our hearts. The greatest one of all. His face shines brighter than the sun. His grace as boundless as His love. He reigns with healing in His wings, the King above all kings, the greatest one of all. Lift up our eyes, see the King has come, light of the world, reaching out for us. There is no other name, there is no other name, Jesus Christ our God. Oh, find hope when all the world seems lost. Behold the triumph of the cross. His power has trampled death and grave. Our life found in His name, the greatest name of all. tremble before him. Chains will break as heaven and earth sing. Holy is the name, holy is the name of Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. The earth will shake and tremble before him. Chains will break as heaven and earth sing. Holy is the name, holy is the name of Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Lift up our eyes, see the King has come. Light of the world, reaching out for us. There is no other name, 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 Jesus.
Well, hey, if you would like to give to the ministries of Grace Church and be a part of keeping this broadcast alive, you certainly can do so by following some of the prompts that are on the screen. But I want to make sure you know there is no obligation to give. We're just glad you're tuning in and spending time with us this morning. But I tell you what we'd love to hear from you. If you can, I'd love for you to take out your phone or your computer and go to whoisgrace.com/next. If you go to that website, you can find a series of options and you can click on Connection Card. I would so encourage you to fill that out. Not only does it let us know that you joined us this morning, but it gives us a chance to get to know you and where you are in your journey and where we as a church can come alongside you and support you. Before we jump into the sermon for today, if you haven't already, I'd encourage you also scan the code and follow Grace on the Bible app. You'll be able to see what we call our read plans that are wonderfully made that can help us go deeper during the week, and it coincides with the series.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Grace. Today, last February, as I do every February, I began to seek God to really lay the foundation for the following year's sermon series at Grace, the one we're in right now. And so I meet with a variety of teams, our pastors and our elders, our creative teams, our communication teams, and we finalize the messages that we'll do during the following September to August. This year, there were these two non-negotiable series that I knew God was calling us to do. One of them is the series that we're launching today. It's called Good Grief. And some of you are thinking, we just did Ecclesiastes a few months ago, and that was pretty depressing. Now we're talking about grief. Like, is Derek okay? Maybe we should just get him some therapy and move on to some happier themes. But here's my hunch. Here's why this is so important. As we've walked through these last 3 years together of just global upheaval, I think we're also suffering from a kind of collective grief. Some people think that grief is only connected to, when somebody dies, but grief is more than the loss of life. It's about the losses in life. Maybe you grieve the loss of a missed opportunity or a relationship or the loss of a job or the loss of your health or the ability to do what you used to do. We all know grief. And COVID brought with it tremendous loss. Like, we all lost the world we knew. Some of you feel like you lost a year of your life. Our kids lost a year of school or a year of sports. Our country lost kind of a workforce or a supply chain. Some of you lost your livelihood. You lost progress that you'd been making in your mental health. You'd lost financial stability. Some of you literally lost someone who died. And so I recognize that there are some of you here today who are grieving something very specific. Like, when I say the word grief, you're right there with me. You're walking through it right now. But others of you, it's just kind of dawning on you. Like, you're going, I am feeling loss over something, or I am sad about that thing. And I never really put it into the category of grief, but that's probably what it is. And so it would be easy for us to just rush right past this collective grief to the more encouraging aspects of faith, like joy and peace. But I think there are treasures to be found if we learn to walk through grief in a healthy way. Like there are thoughts for us to refine and attitudes to adjust and a faith to deepen. On the other hand, grief can have a really negative effect if you allow it to build up in your life over time. That grief is going to start coming out in surprising ways, sometimes in rage or anger, sometimes harsh words or isolation or depression. But so many of our unhealthy reactions to life are the result of unmanaged grief. So here's my big idea today. The goal is not to get over your grief, but to get through it. In other words, it isn't something that you need to conquer and then just move past. It's something that you'll walk through and learn and grow and see what God has for you in all of it. And listen, if you're not personally wrestling through grief right now, I promise you, you know someone who is. And so please take everything that we're going to learn from the scriptures and use it to help yourself and to help them. And there are a few outcomes that I really hope to achieve this month. These are the desired outcomes for this series. The first is to help you identify your own grief and then learn how to walk through it. Second is to discern how you might help others who are grieving. Third, to learn and practice an ancient biblical response to grief called lament. We're going to be doing that at the end of every message. And then fourth, to encourage Christian community as one of the key support methods for walking through grief. So here's what I know about every one of us. You either know someone in a crisis, you're in a crisis yourself right now, or you're getting ready to go into a crisis and you just don't even know it yet. And I think what we learn this month is going to be helpful for everyone in every stage. So there was this Swiss-born psychiatrist, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, and in her book on death and dying, she popularized this thing called the 5-stage model of grieving. It was based upon her research into how terminally ill persons respond to the news of their terminal illness. So her 5 stages have since been used worldwide to describe all kinds of grief responses. So I'll just list the 5 now. The first is shock or denial, where we say, it can't be true, or no, not me. And then there's anger, like, why me? This isn't fair. And then there's a bargaining stage, like, God, if you make this better, then I'll never do blank, blank, blank again, right? And then there's depression. I've admitted my loss, but I now have this deep sadness that has set in. And finally, there's acceptance, like life has to go on, but how? Like, what do I do now? And even though these are called stages, it's important for us to note that grief is not linear ever. Like these are just describing aspects of a typical grief response, mainly so we don't feel like we're crazy as we're walking through it, but they're not prescribing what should occur or how long or in what order, especially in light of the way God can use grief. You see, in all of these stages, God will begin to reshape our thoughts and our attitudes. He will grow us, and He will adjust our hearts and our minds at every part of the process. The thing about these 5 responses is not only that they are observable, but also we find all 5 of them in the scriptures, as some of our biblical heroes have walked through grief and then put their experiences and insights into the pages of the Bible as the Word of God so that we can learn from them. So, we're going to look at one example today. And just one more slight preamble before we get there. This one is a little bit more pastoral. So one of the reasons that I'm so hopeful for this series is that I believe it's going to offer a pathway to healing for some of you. And although things may never be the same for you as they were before, God is still on His throne, and He still loves you, and He still has a path for you to walk on this earth. And I want to remind you that often the most transformative seasons in our lives involve struggle and loss and, yes, grief. And that it may be, for some of you today, that the pain is horrific right now. But you're going to look back in 5 years or 10 years on this time as being one of the most transformative in your whole life. We live in a world of bad news, but we're a good news people. And that good news came in the form of a person named Jesus Christ. And we can expect to be restored through our grief for 2 main reasons, both of which connect to Jesus. One is because of who He is, and the second is because of what He said. But listen to the description of Jesus as prophesied in Isaiah 53:3. It calls Him a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. This means you are walking through your grief with a God who understands you, not as one who's clueless, but as one who has lived it Himself and fully entered into it. He's acquainted with grief. But then listen to what Jesus said in John 16:33. He said, in this world you will have troubles, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And this is good because our faith doesn't ignore the fact that there will be dark and difficult times. But it will also point us to an ultimate victorious outcome. I heard Tim Keller, who's suffering with cancer right now. An interviewer asked him recently, what would you tell someone who's grieving and suffering right now? And Keller said this. He said, I would tell them that if the resurrection of Jesus really happened, everything's going to be all right. Oh man, it's simple but profound. Jesus guarantees our victory in the end so that we can take heart. So we want this series to acknowledge that there are times, yes, to pause and to feel deeply and to do the work of processing our collective pain. But I want to let you know that we're not going to wallow this month. Paul says that, yes, we grieve, but not as those without hope. So throughout God's word, we find these stories and songs and poems of grief that teach us God's perspective. And I just confidently believe that if we'll walk through grief well, that grief will begin to bring about change and it'll bring about healing and growth. And so we're going to keep our eye on that the whole time. So I want to begin week 1 talking about shock and denial. It's the first stage as identified by Kubler-Ross, but we also see lots of evidence in the scriptures. So not just in real life, but in the Bible as well. And I want to just give a shout out to Pastor Rick Warren, who preached a series of messages following his son's suicide. And I owe some of the framework and some of the content from this message and really the whole series to his good work on this subject. But I want you to listen to Ecclesiastes 9:12. It says this. It says, like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare, so the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. All right, so the thing about grief is that it comes as a result of losses in life, and losses tend to sneak up on you. Like you don't see them coming. You're not prepared. And even if there's been a little bit of a lead up time to prepare, often you're just not ready for just how much that loss is going to impact you emotionally. And so there's shock. And this passage in Ecclesiastes says it's just like a fish swimming happily along and it gets scooped up in a net, or a bird that lands and just thinks he's taking a little rest and then boom, he's caught in a snare. That's the way tragedy comes upon us. And when it happens, the natural first reaction in us is shock and denial. Denial is just a defense mechanism that helps to minimize the pain of that loss. It's your brain's way of protecting you from the pain so that you have a little bit of time to adjust to your new reality. So what's the first thing that someone does when they receive terrible news? You'll see them, if you've ever been in the room, they'll just start shaking their head. No, this can't be true. This can't have happened. The Counseling Center at the University of Washington put out a list of some of the characteristics of the initial wave of shock. And the list includes things like feeling numb and being confused and disoriented and shutting down and being unable to process emotions or avoiding reminders of the loss, sleeping more than usual, procrastinating with details surrounding the loss and its consequences, staying busy all the time, engaging in mindless behaviors and being easily distracted, focusing on the needs of others instead of your own, thinking or saying, I'm fine or everything is fine, using substances like alcohol or drugs as a means of escape. These are all the things that are connected to the shock stage. But today I want to take us to the book of Job, maybe the most famous story of loss and grief in the whole Bible. And it's an important reminder that men and women who love God with all their hearts will at times find their lives unraveling. They will walk through the depths of despair and pain. Even godly people will have to suffer. Anyone that claims if you follow Jesus, you're fine, that they haven't read the story of Job. And so Job is like suffering on steroids. And let me just briefly catch you up on the story of Job. Life is going great for Job. Spiritually, financially, relationally, he has found great success in life. He has a big and thriving family, and then everything collapses at once. Job is told that terrorists have come and destroyed his property, just decimated his homes, his buildings. They've either stolen or destroyed all of his livestock. Then also, all of his employees and servants were killed by these marauders. And worst of all of his 10 children were dead. Next, Job loses his health. His body's covered with boils and sores. He loses the respect of his wife. His wife turns against him. And instead of taking his side, she says, here's my advice, dear husband, love of my life. Here's what I would do if I were you. Curse God and die. Well, that's sweet, honey. Thank you, dear. Then his friends come in. And eventually it goes pretty wrong with his friends, but they actually start out well. And so I'm going to pick things up here as Job's friends come to him after all of this tragedy. And before I share some lessons for those of you who yourselves are grieving today, I want to draw out a couple of insights about what to do if you have a friend who's in the shock or denial stage of grief. Look at Job 2:11 through 13. It says, "Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. And they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes, and they sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great." So the first thing that jumps out is that Job and these friends spent 7 days and nights in silence. Job, maybe more. And what does that tell us about him? Well, he's in shock. And he's probably in denial. He's like that fish that got netted or that bird that got snared, and it all came so fast and furious that he can only sit there and stare for a week. And so again, thanks to Rick Warren, but what do you do if you have a friend in shock and denial? Here's the first thing. You show up. Verse 11 says that they made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy and to comfort him. His friends were intentional. They heard about the awful things that had happened to Job, and so they left their homes and they went to him. You know, our friends are desperate for us to simply show up for them in their grief. They need to see that they are important to us and that we're willing to drop everything and go to them, or simply to answer the phone on a Friday night. You know, our instinct often says, well, I need to stay away from them. I need to give them space. And there are times when that's true, and you need to read all the context clues, okay? But the first instinct should be to show up. And then it says they comforted him. What does comfort look like for your friend? Well, maybe a hug, maybe a cup of coffee, maybe watching the kids or cleaning the house. Maybe it's just sitting quietly on the couch and being a constant presence for them. But show up and then do whatever you can do. Don't try to solve their hurt because you can't. Pastor Sarah used to be a Spanish teacher, a little secretly known fact there, but she reminded me recently that in Spanish, the phrase, "I'm sorry," is lo siento, which translates, "I feel it." See, one of the beautiful things that we can do for a friend in grief is just to show up and feel it with them. Ecclesiastes 4:9 through 12 says, 2 are better than 1. If one falls, there's another to help him up. What a pitiable state to fall when you're alone and have no one to help you up. So show up. The second thing to do is shut up. Notice, not only was Job silent for 7 days, but so were his friends. Verse 13 says that they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. You know, when people are in shock and denial, they generally don't need to hear that everything is going to be okay, or that all things work together for good. They just need someone to help bear the suffocating pain. And so Job's friends started out well. But in chapter 4, when they start opening their mouths, that's when it all starts to go downhill. In fact, eventually Job says things like, "If only you would shut up and let that be your wisdom." Or, "You are all miserable comforters," he says in chapter 16. My personal favorite, "How long will you torment me and crush me with your words?" And so when someone's in shock, they don't need pep talks. They need presence. They need you to be there. I read a great article by Susan Silk that talked about this idea of comfort in and dump out. It's a kvetching order. Kvetching just means to complain. And there's a really bad drawing that I'm going to put up. You won't be able to read it, but just listen as I explain it. So you draw a circle, and in the center ring, you put the name of the person who's grieving. It says the aggrieved or the afflicted in there. The next circle around them includes their closest people, parents and children and significant others. And then another circle out is the more distant relatives and friends. And then finally colleagues, and the further out you go, the less intimate the relationship is with the grieving person. But here are the rules. The person in the center ring can say anything she wants to anyone, anywhere. She can kvetch and complain and whine and moan and curse the heavens and say life is unfair and why me. And that's the one payoff for being in the center ring. Everyone else can say those things too, but only to the people in the larger rings than they're in. So when you're talking to a person in a ring smaller than the one you occupy, someone who's closer to the center of the crisis, the goal is comfort. Listening is more helpful than talking. But if you're going to open your mouth, ask yourself if what you're about to say is likely to provide comfort and support. And if it isn't, don't say it. Don't, for example, give advice. Like, people who are suffering from trauma don't need advice. They need comfort and support. So say, I'm sorry. Say, this must be really hard for you. Say, can I bring you a pot roast? Don't say, wait till you hear what happened to me, or here's what I would have done if I were you. If you want to cry or complain or tell someone how shocked you are or how crappy you feel or whine about how it reminds you of all the terrible things that have happened to you lately, that's fine. That's perfectly normal response. Just do it to someone in a bigger circle. Comfort in, dump out. And I thought that was a really helpful principle and rule of thumb to remember. But what if it's you who's grieving? Like, it's not about helping a friend for you. What if it's you? Let me just share 3 things to do if you are in shock or denial. The first sounds very basic, but I want to say it out loud. It's to survive the initial wave. We see Job for the first few chapters doing what he needs to do to survive. He mourns, he grieves, he worships. He breaks a piece of pottery to scratch the sores on his body. He argues, he's quiet. He receives friends, he prays. He's doing whatever he can to get through the initial wave of grief. And having seen grief up close for many years, I just want to get really basic with some of you, starting with just be safe. Don't compound what has happened by being reckless yourself. If you're driving and crying too hard to see straight, pull over. And if you don't care whether you live or die in that moment, let me remind you that your life is still a precious gift to you from God. And even if you can't go on for yourself, do it for the others in your life. Drink water. Crying causes dehydration. Drink water, move, get outside, take a shower, eat. All of these are things that you probably don't want to do, but they're baby steps in just caring for yourself and surviving the initial wave. Another simple thing to do is just to tend to something. Weed the garden, water your plants, brush your pet, bake someone a cake, do something good for someone else. Bring a little order to the chaos in tangible ways. But survive that initial wave. The second is to be honest with yourself and others, and most importantly, God. Henry Cloud said that grief is a process of acknowledging the reality of what's happened, acknowledging how you feel about that reality, and ultimately fitting it into a new understanding of life with that loss. So recognize and name and feel your emotions. Don't rush past them. It's just as important to express your sadness as it is to express your joy. And so if you don't find an expression for this sadness, it will get stuffed down and eventually it will come back out in very unhealthy ways. And so we go back to Job as our example. He worships God beautifully when it doesn't even seem possible. Like he famously says this phrase, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I mean, just incredible faith and worship in the midst of extreme trauma. But we also see in his honesty, Job processing through this grief and loss. Listen to this raw passage in Job chapter 10, starting in verse 1. He says, I loathe my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. Does it seem good to you to oppress and despise the work of your hands and the favor and designs of the wicked? Verse 8, your hands fashioned and made me, and now you have destroyed me altogether. So there's often a lot of confusion about how a person of faith should respond in the shock of a loss. Here's what not to do. The Bible does not say anywhere to just pretend that it doesn't hurt. Like a lot of people grew up being taught that you ought to just have a stiff upper lip and act like it doesn't hurt and that this is just a sign of strength. Guys really struggle with this. In churches, people in churches really struggle. People sometimes get credit for being extra spiritual if something catastrophic happens and they take it in stride. They just keep moving as if it doesn't bother them. And there can be a pressure in the church almost not to grieve and then pretend that that's faith. That is not what Job does here. He is brutally honest with God. And guess what? God is big enough to handle all your emotions, all your questions, all your doubts. Take them straight to him and to your trusted friends. And if you don't have language for it, borrow the language of the Bible. Do you know what the most common kind of psalm is in this big book of Psalms? It's called the Psalm of Lament. The most frequent cries are cries that say, "Why, God?" And "God, how long?" And "God, where are you?" And why have you hidden your face from me, God?" See, during times of grief, you should really befriend the Psalms. You know, the Psalms were the first prayer book of the church. Our most ancient Christian brothers and sisters practiced prayer primarily as the daily memorization and recitation of the Psalms. Tish Harrison Warren said, "Praying the Psalms doesn't simply teach us to express our emotions to God. The practice also shapes our emotions." There's another book in the Bible that's actually just called Lamentations. It's a cheery little Old Testament book. As its name suggests, it's full of laments. The God of the Bible is a very big God who is not threatened in the least by people expressing their anger and grief over hurt. And some of you have been playing the quiet game for far too long. You have losses that you've never mourned. You have tears that you've never cried. And it's okay to face the sadness. I want you to hear these invitations from God. In Psalm 50:15, God says, "Call upon me in your day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me." Lamentations 2:19 says, "Arise, cry out in the night." Like at the beginning of the night watches, pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Do you know why he's crying out in the night? Because when we're in grief, he's probably not sleeping very much. So what do you do when you're up all night and you can't sleep? Cry out to God. Express all of your emotions to him. So in the early stages of shock and denial, the sooner you can get to honesty, the better. The third thing is don't lose sight of hope. I know. Hope will feel like a long ways away, but just keep it in your faintest sight, right out there on the horizon line. Like when you're in a boat with no navigation and you just have to keep the shore in your sights, like even if it's just the faint glow of some buildings off in the distance, that's your focal point to make sure that eventually you can still find your way back home. Job 13, during one of his long monologues, Job says this beautiful phrase. You can almost hear the pain oozing out of it, but you know there's still a distant shoreline for him. It's in chapter 13, verse 15. It says, "Though he slay me, yet I will hope in him." God, I don't know what you're up to. It feels devastating. It actually feels like you're actively opposing me. You're beating me down. You're slaying me. And yet I won't lose sight of hope. I'll keep it in my distant sights. And so he said, if you're walking with a friend through these early stages of grief, shock and denial, the best thing to do is to show up and shut up. And if it's you yourself dealing with shock and denial, we learned from Job's own example to survive the initial wave, to be honest with yourself and others, and most importantly, God, and to don't lose sight of hope. Let me just encourage you with a couple of practical next steps before we turn inward and really practice this. First, will you commit to attend this series? I would also love for you just to invite some folks that you think would be particularly helpful for them, maybe friends or family who are experiencing grief or loss these days. But for you, would you just say, these next 5 weeks, I'm not going to miss a week. I just think that God honors our efforts to prioritize him and our spiritual lives. The second, though, is to get in community. This series is going to be much more meaningful if you have some people to walk through it with. Get in a life group. Find some confidants, an accountability partner that you can go through the daily readings together with over at Who is Grace Read, or text the daily questions or applications to. You can also find a group over at whoisgrace.com/life groups. Now, I said at the beginning that we'd be participating in the practice of lament throughout this series, and we're going to start that today. And I want to just kind of set it up and provide a little backdrop for what this is. There's a great book called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, and the subtext is Discovering the Grace of Lament. It would be a great one for you to grab if you're interested in this subject, and one that we're going to be using extensively during these times at the end of each message. But let me just introduce you to the idea of lament. I'll confess that the practice of lament has been a much neglected dimension of the life of our church, and in turn probably in many of your lives as well. We want to change that because it's a critical tool in activating our faith during life's most difficult moments. So we need to recover kind of this ancient practice of lament because our faith suffers when lament is missing. So generally speaking, lament is how you live between the poles of dealing with tragedy and trusting in God's sovereignty. In the middle is lament. It's how we properly bring our sorrow to God. And so without lament, we settle for inferior ways of processing our pain. We turn to things like isolation or silence or bitterness and even anger. And without lament, we won't know how to help people walking through sorrow. Instead, we're going to offer trite solutions like Job's friends did, or unhelpful comments and impatient responses. We'll also miss the lessons and the many rich biblical laments that are intended to teach us. So lament is how Christians grieve. And it also is how we learn the important truths about God and our world. And so what is Christian lament? Well, Webster defines lament generally as a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. But there's nothing uniquely Christian about grief and sorrow. Everybody identifies with those emotions from time to time. So what does Christian lament look like? Well, as people who believe in righteousness and justice and holiness, we should be grieved when we see and experience unrighteousness and injustice and wickedness in our world and in our own hearts. And so lament is meant to glorify God in the midst of all of it. So in the Bible, lament is more than just sadness. It's more than walking through the stages of grief. Here's the best short definition I can express. Lament is a prayer in pain that leads to trust. It's a prayer in pain that leads to trust. You know, throughout the scriptures, lament gives voice to these strong emotions that we believers feel because of suffering. It wrestles with the struggles that surface. Lament typically flows from at least two questions. One, where are you, God? And two, if you love me, why is this happening? But more than just questions, most biblical laments actually follow a pattern as God takes grieving people on a healing journey. And this pattern usually includes four elements of lament. The first is a turning to God. The second is a complaint. The third is a request. And the fourth is an expression of trust or praise. So that's what we're going to practice together in just a moment. Your host is going to come walk you through a time of lament using Psalm 77 as a blueprint. But before they do that, I just want to acknowledge one more time. Some of you are here today and you're really hurting. And I do believe that lament is a practice that will help you to connect with God in a healthy way. And if you're grieving, can I remind you that suffering is the shortest route to God? Like when the bottom drops out, when everything that can go wrong seems to go wrong. I don't care if you're a Christian or agnostic or an atheist, everybody from a serial killer to the Pope. When suffering comes to you, there's a shortcut straight to God. Okay, God, what are you up to? And suffering positions our faith to grow because suddenly there are questions that we don't have answers to. And we can process those directly with God. And so as you get ready for this time, let me just ask you to call one thing to mind. Are you ready? Will you identify something you've lost? Will you just call to mind something you're grieving, something that's been taken from you? Maybe it's not a something, maybe it's a someone. And I want you to keep that loss in your mind as we walk through this time together. And listen, even if it seems really small, even if you're like, oh, my loss is silly compared to my one friend who lost X, Y, and Z, that horrible thing happened to them. Listen, one of the values of learning this practice is that if you can learn it and master it during the small stuff, when the bigger stuff comes, you're going to be more prepared for that, okay? So let's practice lament together. Love you guys. So we're going to practice lament together. I'm going to be your host today. And I just had you call to mind something that you've lost, something that you're grieving. And I want you to keep that in your mind as we proceed. Remember, we're trying to teach you a skill, a practice that you can literally use continually for the rest of your life during seasons of grief. And so today we're going to use Psalm 77 as a guide. We said that a lament has four parts. The first is turn to God. And so Psalm 77, 1 and 2 says, I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. And in the night, my hand is stretched out. Without wearying, my soul refuses to be comforted. The psalmist is clearly in pain, and yet he's not silent. And he's also not just talking, complaining, or whimpering. He's using his words to cry out to God in prayer. And so I want to invite you in this moment to address God as you come to him in prayer right now. And maybe you pray silently. Maybe you should just write something down, get a piece of paper and write it down. Use it on your phone, but just come to God, call him by name, let him know you're coming before him right now and affirm that you know he's listening. And I'm just going to give you a moment to do that right now in your own words. The second part is to bring your complaint. And so verses 2-4 says, my soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. The psalmist is praying, but it's not bringing immediate comfort or resolution. His prayers are not working, if you will. Yet he still prays. And so lament is not a simple formula. It's a prayer that you pray, believing that one day God will answer and restore, even if it's not today. And so I want you to bring your complaint to God right now. Would you do this? Would you just identify in blunt language the specific pain or injustice that you're experiencing? And take a moment right now to put your complaint into your own words. The third part is to ask boldly. Verse 10 says, and I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High. So this is where the lament takes a turn. After a series of questions, verses 4-9, the questions like, is God angry at me? Has he forgotten me? Will he spurn me forever? The psalmist makes a turn. He turns the corner from complaint, and he basically says, I'm just going to boldly make my appeal to God. So right now, I'm going to invite you to specifically call upon God to take action in a way that fits his character, in a way that resolves your complaint. Would you do that right now? And the final step is to choose to trust. So amidst all of the complaints and questions and requests, there comes a point where we must turn to what we know to be true. Hurting people must grieve, but not aimlessly. The biblical language of lament redirects us toward trusting what's true, regardless of what valley we're walking through and regardless of what we're feeling. So verses 12-14 says, I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the people. And so as we wrap this up, in your own words, will you just affirm God's worthiness to be trusted and commit to praising him? Would you do that right now as we wrap this up?
friends, don't forget, you can take a photo of this QR code or go to whoisgrace.com/read to get started with that read plan that I mentioned earlier. This is something that goes along with the Bible app, and again, it allows you to dive a little bit deeper throughout the week on the sermons that we talk about on Sunday. Please don't forget to fill out a connection card form and get yourself on a path to taking some spiritual next steps. Speaking of next steps, I can't encourage this enough. I would love for you to join us tonight for Grace Online at 8 p.m. Eastern. Grace Online is a live experience where you can chat and get feedback on a short portion of the message, and you can even meet other people from around the country and around the world as they chew on and have fellowship over our sermon series. If you're interested, head on over to whoisgrace.com/online to sign up for reminders. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have a great day, a great week. You leave here blessed and encouraged, and I can't wait to see you next time.
At Bonnell's, we truly believe that you deserve the very best. That's our commitment to you, every day in everything that we do.
At Bonnell's Collision, you'll always get our very best. From free estimates to our highly trained and certified repair technicians to expert painting with our 100% color match guarantee. Bonnell's Collision, a proud part of Bonnell's Auto Group.
You deserve the